Hi, I'm Jess. Welcome to my channel. Now let's talk about books. The book up for discussion today is Shadows of the Workhouse by Jennifer Worth. You may recognize the name of the author. Shadows of the Workhouse is the second book in the Call the Midwife series that inspired the TV show of the same name. In this memoir, Jennifer Worth recounts her own experience and the stories of people she knew while working as a nurse and midwife in London's East End in the 1950s. This video will focus on part 1 of Shadows of the Workhouse Children. Trigger warnings: child abuse, neglect, and incest. Jane was a nervous woman in her mid-40s. She lived in Nonnatus house and handled small, simple tasks. Her nervousness meant that she wasn't suited to being a nurse. She could perform simple tasks, like making deliveries. It took her much longer to complete her tasks than it would take one of the nurses, and she was constantly looking to be praised and needed reassurance that she was doing the right thing. If you've seen the TV show, you may remember Jane from season 2. She was portrayed fairly accurately in the TV show, with the exception of her backstory. Her real history is much darker than the show implies. Prior to working at Nonnatus house, Jane spent 20 years in domestic service, starting from the age of 14. She was a terrible domestic servant and was constantly getting in trouble. This led her to fear making mistakes, which she inevitably would. Jane's only friend was Peggy, who lived with her brother Frank. You may also remember Peggy and Frank from season 1 of the TV show. Their story was pretty accurate to the book. Peggy was a charwoman. She cleaned at Nonnatus house 3 mornings a week. Frank was a fishmonger. His friendship with Jane was even more unlikely than Jane's friendship with his sister. Their friendship dates back to their childhood spent in the workhouse. When workhouses existed, people lived in constant fear of ending up in one. People ended up in these workhouses because of an accident, an illness, unemployment, a pregnancy outside of marriage, old age, and more. But how did the workhouses of the 19th century and early 20th century come to exist? In 1601, Queen Elizabeth I passed the Act for Relief of the Poor, leading to the creation of poorhouses, managed by individual parishes. This system worked until the Industrial Revolution. The societal changes made because of the Industrial Revolution, combined with a rapid increase in the population of the UK, meant that the government could no longer provide for the growing number of poor. In 1834, the Poor Law Amendment was passed, leading to the closure of the small parish poorhouses and the creation of workhouses that could house several hundred people. The goal was that the poor shall be set to work, and they shall dwell in working houses. These workhouses were financed in part by the local poor law rates, and in part through government loans. Income was also generated by the labor of the inmates. The workhouse was supposed to be a place of last resort, so the conditions inside the workhouse were worse than living on the street. To discourage the idle and shiftless from seeking admission into the workhouse, a rigid system of discipline and punishment was introduced. Families were separated, husbands from wives, mothers from children over the age of 7, and brothers from sisters. Workhouses were often minimally heated. The inmates were not provided with warm clothes or adequate blankets. The meals were small, and the inmates were not allowed to leave without the permission of the master. One way that women ended up in the workhouse was pregnancy out of wedlock. If a pregnant woman was abandoned by her lover, and her parents were unwilling or unable to support her, she would end up in the workhouse. After the baby was weaned, the woman was encouraged to leave the workhouse with her baby and find employment. This was often impossible because of a shortage of jobs for women, especially those with babies. The mothers were often encouraged to give up their baby for adoption, and many were medically certified hysterical, of unsound mind, or morally degenerate. and their baby would be forcibly removed. The mother would be expected to leave the workhouse to find employment. If she could not find work, she would have to return to the women's section of the workhouse. This is how Jane ended up in the workhouse. Her mother was dismissed from her job after an illicit liaison with her employer left her pregnant. It was rumored that Jane's father was a high-class gentleman. After his wife found him in bed with the servant was dismissed and went to the workhouse, where Jane was born. Once weaned, Jane was separated from her mother and taken to the infant's nursery, and her mother was sent to the women's section. They never saw each other again. Despite the oppressive environment, Jane was a high-spirited child, always at the center of any mischief. She was often beaten for her disobedience, but it didn't break her spirit. Jane had heard the rumor that her father was a high-born gentleman in Parliament and was certain that one day he would come and take her away. Her fantasies about her father allowed her to endure the abuse at the hands of the workhouse officers and master. When she was 7, Jane started to attend the council school, where she excelled. Jane was an intelligent girl who enjoyed learning. Jane was fortunate that her teacher, Miss Sutton, saw her potential and encouraged her and secretly taught her more advanced lessons than the other workhouse girls. Sir Ian Astor Smalley was a founding member of Oxford Philanthropic Society for the Improvement of Poor Children, a charity dedicated to providing holidays for the children of the workhouse. When Sir Ian visited the workhouse to deliver them news about the holiday for the children, Jane saw him, and he looked exactly like she imagined her father must look. She thought that this must be her daddy coming to take her away. The girls gathered in the hall to be addressed by Sir Ian. While giving his speech, Sir Ian focused his attention on the only girl in the crowd who displayed any emotion, Jane. Jane felt that he was speaking just to her, and he was telling her that he would be taking her away that summer for holidays and then to live in his house. As the girls were leaving the hall, Jane ran to Sir Ian and hugged him, crying, "Thank you, Daddy, thank you, thank you." The master was not pleased with Jane's display of emotion, and he did not miss that Jane called Sir Ian Daddy. He told one of the officers to take her to the punishment room. Jane waited, locked in the punishment room, for 2 hours. When the master and a male officer arrived, the master ordered Jane to repeat after him, "Sir Ian Astor Smalley is not my father." But Jane misheard him and thought he said, "See, a nasty smelly is not my father." Jane, confused, didn't say anything. The master ordered her again to say it. This time, she asked, "A nasty smelly?" Infuriated, assuming that Jane was calling him a nasty smelly, the master ordered the officer to undress her. He then ordered the officer to hold Jane while he beat her with a leather-thronged whip. After the 5th lash, Jane began to lose consciousness and vomited on the officer who held her. The officer kneed her in the mouth, causing her to bite her tongue. The master continued lashing her. Jane was lashed 10 times. The master had wanted to do 20, but his wife had cautioned him that he didn't want to kill her. A nurse and female officer were sent to take Jane to her dormitory. The nurse was horrified by what she saw. She wrapped Jane in her apron and carried her upstairs. The nurse bathed Jane's wounds for hours. When the other girls arrived to the dormitory, Peggy offered to help. Their actions bathing Jane's wounds probably saved her life. After several days, Jane was able to stand again. She was brought to the master's office, where she was told that if she ever called Sir Ian Astor Smalley her father again, she would be flogged again. But this time, the master will be generous, and instead of flogging Jane, she was forced to wear a sack instead of a dress and apron, and her hair was shorn. She was forced to go to school like that. Jane became terrified of everyone, not just adults, but other children too. Jane was further punished when she started bedwetting. Morning after morning, she was forced to hold her wet sheet at the front of the dining hall and go without breakfast that day. Her back eventually healed, but her mind never recovered. She no longer laughed or smiled, but she still looked forward to the day her daddy would come and take her away. On the day they left for the summer holidays, Jane was ordered to stay behind, and her heart broke. She realized that her father was never going to come for her. Being born in the workhouse infirmary wasn't the only way children ended up as inmates. Sometimes they were forced to go to the workhouse after their parents died. That is how Frank and Peggy ended up in the workhouse. When Frank was young, his father would tell him that his job was to look after his mother while he was at work. When Frank was 4, Peggy was born, premature and sickly, and Frank's job became to look after his baby sister. Eventually, Peggy grew stronger. Then Frank's father contracted typhoid and died. Frank's mother was forced to go back to work cleaning offices. Frank's mother had never been strong and was often sick. One day, when Frank was 6 years old, his mother didn't come home from work. When she got to work that day, she felt very weak. It took her much longer to clean than normal. After hauling a bucket of water up the stairs, she collapsed, fell down the stairs, knocking the bucket over. In the morning, she was found at the bottom of the stairs in a puddle of water, dead. Frank and Peggy were taken to the workhouse and admitted to the infant section, where children under 7 were housed. They were bathed, their heads shaved, and dressed in workhouse clothes. Before being taken to the playroom is a bit of a misnomer since there was nothing to play with. It was just a large empty room. One of the boys came over and started to taunt Frank and Peggy. Angry at the events of the day, Frank fought the boy. Peggy ran to the corner crying in fear, where a girl came and comforted her. The girl introduced herself as Jane. That day, Frank, Peggy, and Jane all became friends. After a year, Frank, now 7, was taken to the boys' section. Conditions in the boys' section were harsh. Many of the officers had been brought up in the workhouse themselves and continued to perpetrate the abuse that they once suffered. The younger boys quickly learned not to cry because tears would lead to bullying. Frank often stayed up at night, crying silently. Each dormitory had an officer in charge who slept in a closed cubicle. At night, a boy would get out of bed and slip into the officer's cubicle in search of something to feel less lonely. From 1914 to 1918, when the older boys left the workhouse, it was to the trenches to die. In September 1914, a costermonger named Tip went to the workhouse and spoke to the master. He asked for a boy of 11 or 12 because his own son had gone off to war and he needed a lad to help him out, and Frank was given to Tip. Frank worked hard for Tip. The work in the workhouse was hard, but the work of a coster was harder. They would wake up at 3 a.m. to get to the fish market by 4 a.m. to buy the day's catch to sell. Tip's rounds were about 10 miles. Any product left at the end of the day was Frank's to sell. Tip would tell him the price he wanted to get for it, and anything over that Frank would earn was his to keep. That was his only pay, because room and board was considered payment enough for a coster lad. At 13, Frank decided to leave Tip and go it alone. He felt that he could make more money on his own. Like all other costers, Frank spent money as soon as he earned it, on clothes, booze, girls, and gambling. By 14, Frank was a gambling addict and would gamble on anything. One day, after a big loss gambling, he saw a little boy and a little girl, and they reminded him of Peggy. He remembered that he had promised his father that he would look after his sister. He felt guilty for abandoning her to the cruelty of the workhouse. He decided to do what he could to reunite with her and get her out. Frank went back to the workhouse to talk to the master. He asked what he would need to discharge Peggy into his care. The master said he would need to prove he could provide for her. That meant adequate lodging and some money put by in case of emergency. Frank started working harder. After his regular rounds, he would buy fruit and nuts to sell outside theaters and pubs. He also stopped gambling and opened and opened a savings account. By 16, Frank had saved enough money to apply for the discharge of Peggy from the workhouse. He found a room to rent for them to live in and returned to the master's office. The workhouse board agreed that Peggy could be discharged to Frank if she wanted to be. When Peggy was brought before the board and Frank, she didn't recognize her brother. She hadn't seen him since she was 3. Afraid that his sister would reject him, Frank walked up to Peggy and wrapped his pinky around hers, like he used to when they were young. This stirred a memory in Peggy, and she decided to go with Frank. After 9 years apart, and a childhood without love in the workhouse, it's only natural that Frank and Peggy mistook the familial love they felt for each other for something different. They were basically strangers, but remembered the love they felt for each other as children. I've been thinking about workhouses lately. There's a reason they closed. They're cruel, hard places meant to punish the poor and break their spirits, and I'm very much afraid that they'll make a comeback soon. Prisons are a hugely profitable business in the United States. Just imagine the profits to be had if you could figure out a way to incarcerate people who have not committed any crimes. Trump has stated that he wants the unhoused removed from the streets. He's recently taken steps in D.C. to force the unhoused to either find shelter or be arrested. Pay attention to the way politicians talk about marginalized groups within society. Listen to what they want to do to get rid of them. Remove them from sight, and speak up in defense of those who don't have the social power to defend themselves. Thanks for watching. Leave any questions or comments down below, and have a good rest of your day.